While a man-made disaster isn't unusual in our post-industrial world, the idea of staying behind to tend to the mess, even when you know it'll probably be the last thing you ever do, is. Today, we're talking about the brave band of souls who stayed to tend the Fukushima nuclear power plant during its meltdown in 2011, and why the thousands they saved turned their backs on them, and some even refused to speak their names. Okay, so we talked about the Chernobyl suicide squad, but have you ever heard of the Fukushima 50?
No, I have not.
Aside from what I just told you before I edited that part out because I fucked up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we talked about the Fukushima earthquake that happened in 2011.
Yep.
And we remember the earthquake and the resulting tsunami and a lot of the other things that happened. Japan was a little bit more open than Russia was when Chernobyl happened.
That's for sure.
So we had a better idea of what was going on and how much it impacted us being on the Pacific coast.
Yeah, all the awesome stuff coming up on the shore.
Well, not only that, but the potential radioactive water that was coming our way as well.
Yeah.
Everybody's looking for three-eyed fish. And it's only been 9 years, so, we could still be seeing some really interesting things. But we didn't get the full story. And that's partly because of, it wasn't as sensational, so we didn't get that information, but also because of cultural differences between the United States and Japan. But I think it's a story that's worth telling. This is the story of the Fukushima 50, who, after the earthquake, stepped in and once again made a move to save the world when they didn't have to. So on the morning of March 11th, a massive earthquake measuring 6.6 on the Richter scale just off the coast of Japan. It was initially a 7.1, but they downgraded it to a 6.6. It was so incredibly destructive because the epicenter of the quake was just 22 miles offshore and only 8 miles deep, which means that rather than the tremor being partially absorbed by the ground, it ran along the surface. And there were a series of massive aftershocks that came after the earthquake that just made the damage that much worse.
Yeah, I was watching those videos of the tsunamis, and it was that just alone was huge.
Well, yeah, and they were caused by that, and I'll tell you why. But first, let's talk about the Fukushima power plant. Now, it's not just near the coast of Japan. It's literally on the edge of the island.
Which makes total sense to do that.
It actually does, because
the water,
they're able to use the seawater in cases of emergency, and you'll see why that was so important. So the rocky stretch of rugged shoreline was at a risk from tidal surges, so they built an 18-foot seawall to go around the plant. And initially that was thought to be enough. But not long before the earthquake, that wall had been inspected by TEPCO, the company that owns the Fukushima power plant. And they took their findings to Japan's regulating agency, and they said, we don't think that this is going to be adequate if we have a big earthquake. If there's a large tidal surge, it's going to go over the wall, and that's going to be a problem. And while the regulating agency agreed, they set the information aside because they thought, we have bigger problems to deal with right now. The Fukushima power plant was 40 years old, and many of the systems that were in place were 40 years old.
Nice.
So that was their primary concern, dealing with things like that. They figured the seawall, we'll get to it when we get to it. They would come to regret that decision.
Just a minor little thing. Don't worry about it.
It's just a little thing. Small, unimportant.
Not.
So when the tremors initially hit on the morning of March 11th, the crew at Fukushima charged into action. Japan was prone to earthquakes, and they had trained for this. They knew that this was a likelihood, not a possibility. So they stepped in and they did what they do best. They switched on the emergency systems. Power was knocked out to the power plant. Their backup generators kicked on. They were ready to go. And in the beginning, everything was going well. They'd already, They'd already shut down reactors 1, 2, and 3 to prevent an accidental overload. The other reactors were already offline for maintenance. So they thought, we've got this, not a problem. The generators were only in place to keep the water circulating. Remember at Chernobyl, they were testing to make sure the turbines would continue circulating the water.
And typically failed.
Well, yes, they did. But at Fukushima, they had their backup generators to provide the same service. We're good. Everything's functioning as it should. But then one of the generators failed. But they have more than one generator. There are redundancies in place to make sure that they keep going. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're in good shape until the waves hit.
Yeah, backup generators don't run very well underwater.
Well, here's the thing. When the first wave hit, it hit the seawall and receded. But what happens in tsunamis?
Got the repeat, the backup. Well, I don't forget what it's called.
Secondary waves.
Something wave.
So the primary wave isn't always the biggest wave. Often it's the secondary and tertiary waves that are larger. And that's what happened at Fukushima. Guess where the generators were?
Right on the shoreline, of course.
Oh, no.
Right by the walls.
Under the power plant.
Oh, that's a great idea.
And what happens when water flows into an area?
It floods.
Yeah, the generators went underwater and predictably
They
failed.
should have been on pedestals above ground.
Yeah.
That's where I would put them.
So I've got these pictures on the website, and you can see what it looked like when that wall of water came. It was extraordinary. You saw the pictures. We saw ships that were well inland. Well, imagine all of that water falling over the seawall and being trapped behind it and flooding the power plant. That's essentially what happened. The second wave, as I said, was far more violent than the first. The rush of seawater moved in. It hit the diesel generators. They were no longer able to circulate water as they had been designed to. And without that water circulating, you can imagine what happened.
Shit gets hot.
Shit gets hot fast. And water that was supposed to be cooling the rods began to heat up and vaporize. And what did we learn from Chernobyl?
Hydrogen. Boom.
Yeah, big boomies. So while the power was eventually restored and the pumps eventually were able to circulate water, the damage was already done. The water that was in those holding tanks had already begun to vaporize. So had the pumps been put back into service when the tanks were full, it would have been fine. They would have been able to cool things down and prevent a meltdown. That wasn't the case. So the water is vaporizing off, the cooling rods are exposed, and they're literally actively melting down. This is very, very bad.
Yeah.
Within just a few days after the initial tsunami waves, the 3 operating reactors were all melting down and in danger of a total failure. An event such as that would have made the dropping of nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki seem like a firecracker. They estimated that not only would it have taken out most of Japan and all the people there, but a decent part of Europe as well.
That's a lot of people dead.
Enter the Fukushima 50. So obviously they had to evacuate as many people as they possibly could, but 50 workers stayed on site. Initially it was 50. Eventually it was far more than that, but the name kind of stuck because, poetry.
Yeah.
So the Fukushima 50, they stayed rather than evacuating because they needed to get it to stop. They needed to protect the island. They needed to protect the people. And in Japan, their society, even in the 21st century, is far more connected to honor, I think, than most of our Western cultures are.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why we don't hear these stories, is that for them, the Fukushima disaster was just that. It was a disaster, and it was dishonorable, and it was shameful. You can go to Japan now, and people who are connected with the incident still don't speak of the Fukushima 50. They're not somebody to be honored for the sacrifice they made. They're people that we are ashamed of speaking of because, they were there and they caused it in the first place. So it's an interesting dichotomy that we don't have here. But as with Chernobyl, these people stepped in and worked nonstop for weeks, repairing what they could, venting radioactive steam, and trying to get more water in to circulate around the cooling rods to prevent a larger disaster. TEPCO, the company that owned the Fukushima power plant, stepped in and said, you need to stop because you're venting these steam clouds and there's a radioactive cloud that's heading for Europe. You need to not do this. But the crew at Fukushima, and I had the name of the foreman and I lost it, and I should have found it before we had this discussion, but I'll find it. Too late now. But he basically said, no, he's not going to do that. And this is one of the controversies that we did hear about on the news, where they were using seawater to flood the facility and how that was such a huge controversy. But apparently he chose to do that because that was the only way he could get the cooling rods to cool off quickly enough. If he had stopped venting the steam, if he had stopped pumping in water from the sea, the reactors would have gone into full meltdown. Chernobyl times 3. So he ignored it, disobeyed a direct order, and saved the world. Yay.
Sometimes you just gotta say, fuck it. You're wrong, dude.
Well, it's a matter of saving. He literally, you have to do what's right because it's the right thing to do, regardless of what it does for you. And what they estimated is that the high levels of radiation from the incident would have poisoned the waters around Japan for hundreds of miles, reaching as far as our west coast. They estimated that it would have made waters toxic all the way up to California and Oregon, which is, really close to home for us.
Yeah, that would have been just awesome.
And that would have impacted millions of people, supply chains from the east, fishing, farming, and even product production. It would have been felt absolutely everywhere. I mean, consider how much of our fishing is done in the Pacific, how much of that water ends up in our farmlands, and how much of the production of the products that we use in the United States comes out of China, which would have been impacted by this as well.
Yeah, it'd have been huge.
It would have been a cataclysmic global event. But these folks stayed, and there was even a group that volunteered, retired engineers, doctors, nurses. They volunteered to go in and take the place of the people at Fukushima that were working because they figured, we're old. Which I think is incredibly sad, but also terribly heroic. To say, you know what, I've had a good run. I volunteer. The government said, nah, we'll let these people do it. So they didn't end up going. So they battled the reactor for more than 2 weeks before they were able to bring it under control. And it took months to clean up afterwards. They exposed themselves to hundreds of times more radiation than the human body was meant to handle. And they knew full well that maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, certainly, this was a suicide mission. Now, officially, Japan has only recorded 1 death because of the radiation at Fukushima.
Bullshit.
Maybe. I couldn't find any more information than what the official party line was.
Well, all those 50 guys that were in there are dead.
Yeah.
Going to be.
Eventually. What they did say, though, was that 2,200 people died, resulting in the subsequent evacuation. So people who were injured, people who probably caught in the tsunami waters. I don't know what else. They weren't really that specific. And 18,500 people lost their lives as a result of the earthquake and the actual tsunami. So you remember watching those videos with me when it hit all of those villages that were just completely annihilated. There were people
Yeah.
in those buildings. There were people on those boats. There's this one really famous photo that I'll show you later of a journalist who was down covering all of it when the tsunami hit. And it's just horrifying. He's trying to climb out of his car when the water's hitting his car. And he's just surrounded by vehicles and water. And to think that 18,500 people went through the same things. He did end up surviving. But many other people didn't. The reality is, we don't know what actually happened to all of those people. Like I said, in Japan, it's not something that they're happy to chat about. In America, we sort of embrace our darkness. We like to, it's like my grandma. Remember how I told you my grandma would only write me letters when somebody had died or something horrific had happened?
Yeah, well, news in America just thrives on tragedy. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Tragedy. English is hard.
Yeah.
No, it absolutely, but it's not just the news, it's the American people. We tend to be open with our suffering. In Japan, for many people, the whole incident at Fukushima is seen as sort of a badge of disgrace, and it's not something that they speak about openly. So the real toll isn't known to us. But there is a very large exclusion zone around Fukushima that is not open for human habitation. I did find something on a single farmer who's there. He had his little farm and his cattle, and he can't sell any of his goods. He can't sell any of his beef. He can't sell any of the crops that he grows on his farm because it's radioactive. But it's all he has, so he's not leaving. He lost everything.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't think you'd want to eat any of it yourself, even.
Well, he figures he's radioactive
Get the
too,
hell
so
out.
he doesn't want to leave. He lost his wife and his children, his parents. He literally has nothing else. And that happened to a lot of people. I didn't find any other stories about other people that were living in the exclusion zone, but I'm sure there have to be other people. There can't just be
Oh,
one
yeah,
person.
there's always somebody else say, I ain't going to leave my place, so no matter what.
But in any case, that's the story of the people who stayed behind and bravely worked hard. I found a great video on YouTube, the infographic show, that talks about all of the technical specifications and exactly what led to the meltdown and what they did to get everything up and running. And of course, our blog goes into a little bit more information, but I just thought it was a really interesting story, not just because of what happened at Fukushima and how this brave group of people stepped in to do the right thing because it was the right thing, but also the differences in our cultures and why in America we see them as heroes. There's a movie that's coming out where we, literally pay homage to these people who stepped in and saved the world. Whereas in Japan, it's not necessarily something to be proud of because you fucked it up in the first place, you dumbass.
Yeah, but it sucks that they don't even see them as heroes when they're risking their lives for them.
Exactly.
To help all these people out.
Yeah, I mean,
you got to give them some accolades for it.
I would think so too. I mean, I can see their perspective. If you hadn't done it wrong in the first place, we wouldn't be in this position.
Yeah.
But, the fact is they could have run for it. A lot of people did. Hundreds of people bailed.
Oh, of course.
Because it's human nature. I mean, I could stay here with the nuclear bomb or I could leave. And let's face it, I mean, at my work, my job is purely administrative. If something blows up at my work, I can't help anybody. Well, I mean, it can. I'm first aid trained, but beyond that, am I going to go rushing into a fire? All of my coworkers are bigger than I am. Let's throw the 300-pound welder over my shoulder and pack him out. I'm useless. So I would probably be one of those people that would evacuate because my being there does more harm than good. But I would like to think that if there's something that I could do, I would. But you don't know until you're in that position. But the idea that these people stepped in when they didn't have to, I think to me, it's less weird than it is just amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely not weird as fuck.
No, but my next story is. You want to hear about screaming mummies?
Sure.
Want to stay connected between shows? Find us on Instagram at WeirdAsFCKPodcast, on Facebook at WeirdAsFCKPodcast, on Twitter at WeirdAsFuckPod1, they're a little bit more open-minded, or on the web at www.weirdasfck.com. There you can check out our blog, get more information on each episode, pick up some merch, send us ideas for future shows, or share your own weird experiences. You might even make it on a future episode. We would love to hear from you. Until then, tune in and keep it weird. Are you entertained? Step on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Your 5-star rating helps to boost us up in the listings so other podcast listeners can find the show.